I was supposed to be on a flight to Portland that morning, heading to my sister's lake house for the holidays, the kind of trip people look forward to all year. My suitcase was already checked in, my boarding pass folded neatly in my coat pocket, and my mind was already drifting toward quiet mornings by the water. But just as I pulled into the long-term parking lot, a sudden thought hit me so hard it made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I had forgotten the original will, Arthur's real will, not the photocopy I kept in my desk drawer, but the one he trusted me to protect. I told myself it would take 5 minutes, 10 at most. I turned the car around, unaware that those few minutes would change everything I thought I knew about my own son. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. Too still. Too quiet. I didn't call out like I usually did. I didn't drop my keys into the bowl by the door. Something inside me went alert the way it does right before bad news arrives. As I moved down the hallway, I heard voices coming from the study. Low. Controlled. Careful. I stopped just short of the doorway, pressing myself against the wall, barely breathing. Then I heard my son's voice. Grant's voice, calm, confident, unfamiliar in the worst possible way. He was talking about me. About my age. About my memory. About how, with the right paperwork, a case could be made. Another man answered him, someone older, professional. A lawyer. I recognized the name Grant mentioned. Ashby. The same man he had introduced to me weeks earlier under the excuse of helping organize your finances. My heart didn't race. It slowed. That was the frightening part. I realized they weren't discussing possibilities. They were planning. Guardianship. Control. My life being reduced to checklists and legal language, all without my knowledge. I stepped back quietly, terrified that the floorboards might betray me. Outside the sun was warm, but my entire body felt cold. I sat in my car afterward, staring straight ahead, keys still clenched in my hand, realizing that the woman who raised him, sacrificed for him, trusted him, was now being quietly prepared for removal from her own life. I didn't go to the airport. I didn't call my sister. I just drove. The road blurred as memories rose up uninvited. Grant as a boy asking endless questions, stacking books higher than his own head, begging to understand how things worked. Arthur reading the newspaper while Grant built towers of sugar packets on cafe tables. Somewhere along the way, curiosity had turned into calculation. Care had turned into control. And I had been too tired, too trusting to notice when the shift happened. I stopped at an old bakery I hadn't visited in years, the kind of place that still smelled like butter and cinnamon the moment you opened the door. I sat by the window, wrapping my hands around a warm cup of coffee, watching strangers hurry past, completely unaware that my world had just tilted. Memories rearranged themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. The accountant Grant replaced. The automatic payments he set up without asking. The way he insisted on handling things after Arthur passed. I had called it help. Now I knew better. From there, I drove to the library where I had worked most of my life. The building had changed, but the smell hadn't. Old paper, dust, and ink. It grounded me. I moved through the archives with muscle memory guiding my hands, locating the file that held Arthur's will. As I read through his notes, his careful handwriting, something inside me steadied. Arthur had trusted me. He had been precise. He had left protections in place. And suddenly, I understood that this wasn't about fear anymore. It was about clarity. By the time I left the library, the sky had darkened. I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel weak. I felt awake. That night, sitting alone in my quiet house, I realized something crucial. I wasn't just overhearing a betrayal. I was standing at the edge of a choice. I could remain silent and let my life be rewritten by someone else, or I could begin documenting the truth, carefully, patiently, and on my own terms. That day, without raising my voice or confronting anyone, I stopped being just a mother. I became something else entirely. And this was only the beginning. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks of a house I had lived in for over 30 years, but for the first time it didn't feel like a place of comfort. Every sound felt loaded with meaning. Every shadow felt like a witness. My mind replayed Grant's voice again and again, not angry, not cruel, but chillingly practical, as if he were discussing the weather instead of dismantling his own mother's independence. I realized then that betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern disguised as help, delivered with a smile. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and opened the small cedar chest at the foot of my bed. The one Arthur used to joke was my vault. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in years. Bank statements, insurance policies, handwritten notes Arthur insisted on keeping copies of just in case. At the bottom was a sealed envelope with my name written in his careful block letters. I remembered the day he gave it to me, how serious he looked, how he made me promise not to open it unless something felt wrong. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a letter, dated 2 months before he died, explaining that he had noticed Grant pushing too hard, asking too many questions about control and access. Arthur had trusted Grant with love, but not with authority. The letter didn't accuse, but it warned. It urged me to stay alert, to never sign anything I didn't fully understand, and to remember that age did not equal incompetence. By the time I finished reading, tears streamed down my face. Not from fear but from relief. Arthur had seen this coming. I wasn't imagining things. The next morning I acted normal. That was the hardest part. When Grant stopped by with coffee and that practiced look of concern, I smiled and thanked him. I listened while he talked about simplifying things and making life easier. I nodded at the right moments. Inside I was taking notes. Not written ones, mental ones. I watched how he avoided specifics, how he redirected questions, how he spoke over me just slightly, enough to establish dominance without appearing rude. After he left, I didn't cry. I didn't call a friend. I opened my laptop and started researching guardianship laws in our state. The language was dense, intimidating by design, but I pushed through it line by line. I learned how easily autonomy could be stripped if the narrative was controlled by someone else. I learned how medical opinions could be influenced, how paperwork could be rushed, how silence could be interpreted as consent. And I learned something else too: prevention was far easier than reversal. That afternoon, I made an appointment with an attorney of my own, one Arthur had once recommended but Grant had dismissed as old-fashioned. The meeting was quiet, professional, and validating in a way I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time since Arthur's funeral, someone spoke to me not as a fragile widow, but as a competent adult. We reviewed documents together. We discussed protections. We put safeguards in place that could not be overridden quietly. Walking out of that office, I felt taller somehow, steadier on my feet. Still, the emotional weight lingered. This wasn't just a legal battle waiting to happen. It was a personal reckoning. I had raised Grant to be independent, intelligent, ambitious. I had celebrated those traits. I had never imagined they would be turned against me. That evening, I cooked dinner slowly, deliberately, grounding myself in familiar motions, chopping vegetables, stirring sauce, setting the table for one. As I ate, I realized something painful but clarifying. The son I loved still existed, but the man he was becoming was someone I could no longer trust blindly. Love did not require surrender. Family did not justify erasure. By the time I washed the last dish and turned off the kitchen light, my fear had transformed into resolve. Whatever Grant was planning, he would no longer be operating in the dark. I didn't need confrontation yet. I didn't need drama. What I needed was patience, preparation, and the willingness to see things as they truly were, even when that truth hurt. And deep down, I knew this was no longer just about protecting myself. It was about reclaiming my voice before someone else decided it was no longer worth hearing. Over the next few days, I became acutely aware of how carefully Grant was watching me, as if he were waiting for something to slip. A mistake, a sign of weakness, a crack he could widen. He called more often, stopped by unannounced, and began framing his concern in a way that sounded almost rehearsed. "You seem tired lately," he'd say, his eyes scanning my face instead of meeting it. "Are you eating properly? Or worse, have you been forgetting things? You know stress can do that." Each comment landed softly, but together they formed a pattern, one that made my skin prickle. I responded calmly, deliberately, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to expect. Inside, though I was unraveling old memories, seeing them in a new light, I remembered how years ago he'd insisted on handling Arthur's online accounts just to help, how passwords changed without discussion, How decisions slowly shifted away from joint conversations into private arrangements. Back then, I had trusted the process because I trusted my family. Now, trust felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums, I came across a picture of Grant as a boy, missing his front teeth, standing proudly beside the crooked birdhouse Arthur had helped him build. The image hit me harder than any argument could have. That boy hadn't planned this. Somewhere between then and now, ambition had replaced empathy, and convenience had overtaken compassion. That evening, Grant arrived with paperwork. He didn't announce it as such, just a casual, "I brought a few things we should look over." The papers were neatly stacked, flagged with colored tabs, the language dense and technical. He positioned them between us at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once done homework while I packed his lunches. "This just makes everything easier," he said, tapping the top page. "Temporary authority. Purely for emergencies." I didn't touch the papers. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked him to explain each section slowly, clearly, in plain language. He stumbled, not dramatically but enough. His explanations became vague, circular. When I asked why certain clauses were open-ended, his jaw tightened. That was the moment I knew without doubt. This wasn't protection. It was control. I thanked him for bringing the documents and told him I would review them with my attorney. The word attorney changed the air in the room instantly. His posture stiffened. His tone sharpened just a fraction. "I don't think that's necessary," he said. "We're family." I met his gaze and replied evenly, "That's exactly why it is." After he left, my hands shook so badly I had to sit down. Not from fear of him, but from the realization that my own child was prepared to override my will if it suited his timeline. The next day, I took another step I never imagined needing to take. I scheduled a full medical evaluation, comprehensive and documented. Not because I doubted myself, but because I understood how easily doubt could be manufactured. I wanted records, clarity, proof that my mind was sound and my decisions were my own. The doctor treated me with respect, spoke to me, not over me. And when the results came back, they confirmed what I already knew. I was healthy, capable, clear-headed. I filed copies with my attorney and kept one set locked away at home. Slowly, a strange calm settled over me. The panic that had once tightened my chest began to loosen, replaced by something steadier, determination. I stopped reacting and started observing. Grant's patience began to thin. His messages grew shorter, less affectionate. The warmth he once performed faded when he realized I wasn't yielding. Still, he hadn't backed down. He was regrouping, recalculating. And I understood then that this wasn't going to end with a single conversation or a signed refusal. This was a quiet war of narratives. His version of a concerned son versus my reality as a woman refusing to disappear politely. As I stood at the kitchen window one evening, watching the sun dip below the trees, I felt grief. Not just for Arthur, but for the family dynamic I thought was unbreakable. Yet beneath that grief was resolve. I wasn't fighting to punish anyone. I was fighting to exist on my own terms. And I knew now with absolute certainty that whatever came next, I would not face it unprepared, silent, or alone. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Grant would shift tactics once he realized intimidation wasn't working. Instead of pressure, he tried pity. His calls became softer, his voice lower, almost wounded. He spoke about stress, about how hard things were for him, about responsibilities weighing on his shoulders. "I'm just trying to do the right thing," he said one afternoon, sitting across from me with his hands clasped together like a man asking forgiveness rather than authority. He talked about bills, about long-term planning, about how people my age sometimes underestimated how vulnerable they were. I listened quietly, not interrupting, not correcting him, letting the performance play itself out. What struck me wasn't just what he said, but what he avoided. He never asked what I wanted, never asked how I envisioned the rest of my life. It was all framed as inevitability, as if my independence were a temporary illusion he was patiently waiting to outlast. After he left that day, I realized something unsettling. Grant didn't see me as a person navigating grief, he saw me as a problem to be managed. That understanding hardened something inside me. I began documenting everything. Dates, conversations, changes in tone, unexpected visits. I saved messages. I kept a notebook tucked into the back of a drawer, not because I wanted conflict, but because I knew how easily memory could be questioned when power shifted hands. Around the same time, I noticed subtle changes in my environment. My mail arrived late some days. A utility bill I knew I had paid showed a warning notice. When I called to clarify, the representative casually mentioned someone had tried to change the account contact information the previous week. That someone hadn't been me. The confirmation sent a chill through me. Not panic, but something colder and sharper. I tightened my safeguards quietly. Two-step verifications. New passwords. Locked credit reports. I didn't announce any of it. I learned quickly that silence, when chosen, could be a form of strength. Grant sensed the distance growing and grew frustrated. His kindness began to crack, impatience slipping through like hairline fractures in glass. One evening he confronted me directly. "Why are you acting like this?" he demanded. "Like I'm the enemy." I took a breath before answering, because the truth mattered too much to rush. "I'm acting like someone who wants to stay in control of her own life," I said. "If that feels threatening to you, that's something you need to think about." He stared at me, stunned, as if I'd spoken a language he didn't recognize. That night, after he stormed out, I cried. Not because I felt defeated, but because I finally allowed myself to mourn the son I thought I had. The grief was sharp, but it was honest. In the days that followed, whispers reached me from unexpected places. A neighbor mentioned Grant had asked questions about assisted living facilities nearby. A distant relative called to ask if everything was okay, because Grant had expressed concern about my memory. That was when I understood the full scope of what he was attempting. Not a single move, but a narrative. A slow drip of doubt planted in other people's minds, so that when he finally acted, it would seem reasonable, even necessary. I felt anger then, but it was controlled, focused. I met with my attorney again and laid everything out. She listened carefully, then nodded and said something that changed how I saw the situation entirely. "You're not reacting late. You're reacting just in time." Together we reinforced my protections. Legal documents updated, authority clearly defined, boundaries formally recorded. I left her office feeling lighter, steadier. Grant, meanwhile, was growing desperate. His messages became curt, transactional. The warmth was gone, replaced by a thinly veiled irritation. He was running out of angles and he knew it. One afternoon I stood in the living room, surrounded by the life Arthur and I had built. Photos, furniture, small imperfections that made the space ours. And I realized this fight wasn't about money or control alone. It was about erasure. About deciding when a woman's voice became inconvenient enough to silence. And I wasn't ready to be silent. Not now. Not ever. Whatever Grant tried next, I knew it would be bolder, riskier. People like him didn't back away quietly when they believed something was owed to them. They escalated. And as calm settled over me once more, I prepared myself, not with fear but with clarity, for the moment when his next move would finally reveal just how far he was willing to go. The shift came quietly, almost politely, which is how I knew something serious was unfolding beneath the surface. Grant stopped calling altogether. No check-ins, no arguments, no forced concern. At first, the silence felt like relief, but it didn't take long for me to recognize it as strategy. People like Grant didn't retreat, they recalculated. I felt it in the way the air seemed heavier when I walked into familiar rooms, in the way conversations with extended family suddenly felt guarded, like everyone was holding back a question they didn't want to ask directly. Then the letter arrived. It was official-looking, thick paper, neutral language, but its intent was unmistakable. It suggested an evaluation, framed as routine, framed as care, framed as precaution. Someone Grant had raised concerns about my well-being, my decision-making, my ability to live independently. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the anger pass before it could cloud my judgment. This was the escalation I had been expecting, just not in such a clean bureaucratic form. He wasn't trying to overpower me emotionally anymore. He was trying to outmaneuver me institutionally. That realization steadied me. I called my attorney immediately. She wasn't surprised. In fact, she sounded almost relieved. "Good," she said. "Now we're dealing with something tangible." We moved quickly. I gathered documentation, medical records, financial statements, letters from professionals who had worked with me for years. I scheduled my own independent assessments on my terms with people who had no connection to Grant. I refused to let him define the narrative. Still, the emotional toll crept in during quiet moments. Late at night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying years of motherhood, wondering where things had turned. Had I missed something? Had love blinded me? Or had Grant always been this way, simply waiting for a moment of vulnerability to reveal it? Those questions didn't weaken me, but they did sadden me deeply. When the day of the evaluation arrived, I dressed carefully, not to impress but to feel like myself, calm, grounded, present. I answered every question honestly without defensiveness. I spoke about my routines, my plans, my boundaries. I spoke about grief, yes, but also about resilience. I didn't minimize my age, but I refused to let it define me. The professionals listened, took notes, asked follow-ups. At no point did I feel diminished, and that mattered more than I expected. Meanwhile, Grant began to unravel. His messages returned, sharper now, edged with accusation. He asked why I was making things difficult, why I couldn't just trust him. Trust. The word landed heavily, stripped of its meaning. Trust wasn't something demanded, it was something built, preserved, honored. And he had spent months dismantling it piece by piece. When I didn't respond the way he expected, his frustration spilled over into the open. He confronted me again, this time without pretense. "You're embarrassing me," he said. "People are starting to ask questions." I met his gaze steadily. "Good," I replied. "They should." That was the moment the balance of power shifted. He saw it too. The confidence he'd worn like armor cracked, revealing something smaller underneath: fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of exposure. Fear that the story he'd been telling others was no longer holding together. After that, things moved quickly. The evaluation results came back unequivocal. I was deemed fully capable, independent, competent. The concerns raised were noted as unsubstantiated, driven more by external pressure than genuine observation. When I read the report, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. Not because I doubted myself, but because validation, when you've been subtly undermined, carries its own kind of healing. Grant didn't take the news well. His calls stopped again, this time for good reason. He had overplayed his hand, and he knew it. The people he'd tried to sway began to distance themselves, their apologies tentative but sincere. I accepted them without bitterness. I had learned that holding on to anger only prolonged the damage. What mattered was that the truth had surfaced, quietly but firmly. In the days that followed, I reclaimed pieces of my life I hadn't realized I'd been bracing to protect. I laughed more easily. I slept more deeply. I began making plans. Not reactive ones but hopeful ones. And yet I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't entirely over. Grant was the kind of man who struggled with finality. Losing didn't sit well with him, especially when he believed the outcome should have been inevitable. I knew there would be consequences, conversations, perhaps even a reckoning I couldn't yet see. But for the first time since Arthur's passing, I felt something close to peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of self-trust. Whatever came next, I was ready. Not because I expected victory, but because I had finally stopped questioning my right to stand my ground. And that, I realized, was something no one could take from me. Peace, I learned, is rarely loud. It settled into my days slowly, almost cautiously, as if it wasn't sure it would be welcome. After the evaluation, after the quiet retreat of Grant's accusations, life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became mine again. I began noticing small things that had slipped past me before. How morning light filled the kitchen, how my hands no longer shook when I opened mail, how silence no longer felt like something waiting to attack. Yet underneath that calm I sensed movement, like the ground adjusting after an earthquake. Grant had lost a battle, not the war, and people like him didn't accept loss easily. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was telling a new version of the story now. One where he was the victim. Overwhelmed, misunderstood, burdened by an ungrateful parent who refused help. I didn't correct them. I'd learned that truth didn't need constant defense. It revealed itself over time. What concerned me more was the legal residue he'd left behind. documents half-filed, permissions vaguely worded, obligations implied but never confirmed. My attorney advised we clean everything decisively. So we did. We reviewed wills, powers of attorney, medical directives, things most people avoid because they feel like invitations to mortality. For me, they felt like armor. Each signature reclaimed a boundary. Each clause clarified intent. There would be no ambiguity left for someone else to exploit. During this process, I uncovered something that tightened my chest more than any confrontation ever had. Grant had attempted, quietly and unsuccessfully, to access accounts that weren't his. Not large sums, just enough to test the waters. Enough to see if anyone was watching. The realization stung not because of the money, but because of the calculation behind it. This hadn't been impulsive. It had been planned. I sat with that truth for a long time, allowing myself to grieve not just the loss of trust, but the loss of the son I thought I knew. Still, grief didn't paralyze me anymore. Clarified me. I began pulling away from the role I had unconsciously played for decades, the one who smoothed things over, who absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to. I stopped explaining myself. When people asked how things were with Grant, I answered honestly but briefly. We're not in contact right now. No apologies. No justifications. That shift unsettled some people. They were used to my softness being available on demand. I realized then how often kindness gets mistaken for permission. Around this time, an unexpected letter arrived. Not from Grant, but from someone I hadn't heard from in years. A distant relative who had witnessed more than I realized, who had seen Grant's behavior long before I was ready to name it. The letter was simple, almost tentative, but it affirmed something I needed to hear. You're not imagining this. You never were. I cried when I read it, not from sadness but from relief. Validation has a way of unlocking emotions we didn't know we'd been holding hostage. As weeks passed, Grant made one final attempt to regain footing. He showed up unannounced. No anger this time. No threats. Just quiet urgency. He spoke about reconciliation, about misunderstandings, about moving forward, as a family. I listened without interrupting, watching his expressions more than his words. When he finished, he waited, confident I think that silence meant weakness. Instead, I told him the truth. That reconciliation without accountability wasn't healing. It was erasure. That love didn't require access. That being his mother did not mean surrendering my autonomy. He stared at me as if I'd spoken a language he'd never learned. For a moment I saw the child he once was flicker across his face. Confused, wounded, searching. Then it vanished, replaced by something harder. He left without another word. I didn't chase him. That night I slept deeply without dreams. In the days that followed, I began imagining a future that wasn't defined by damage control. I enrolled in a class I'd always wanted to take. I traveled, not far, just enough to remind myself that the world still welcomed me. I reconnected with friends I'd grown distant from, not because of conflict, but because life had narrowed around one relationship for too long. And in those moments of rediscovery, I understood something quietly powerful. I hadn't just survived this. I had evolved through it. Grant's absence left a space, yes, but it was no longer a wound. It was a boundary. And boundaries, I realized, are not walls built out of anger. They are doors that decide who gets to enter. I didn't know if Grant would ever truly understand what he'd lost, or if he'd simply rewrite history until it fit his comfort. But I knew this. Whatever story he told the world, I finally knew how mine ended, and how it continued. With clarity. With strength. With a sense of self that no longer trembled when challenged. And as I looked ahead, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not relief, not vindication, but quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that stays. By the time autumn arrived, I understood that healing doesn't announce itself with dramatic moments. It reveals itself in how you react when old triggers return and no longer control you. That lesson came sooner than expected. One afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something in me said answer. On the other end was Grant's wife, her voice careful, rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this conversation many times. She didn't start with apologies or explanations. She started with exhaustion. She told me Grant had been struggling, financial pressure, work instability, anger that never seemed to land anywhere productive. She said he talked about me often, not with affection, but with resentment masked as responsibility. Then came the sentence she likely dreaded, saying, "He says you abandoned him." I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her. I let the words sit between us, heavy and revealing. When she finished, I spoke calmly, choosing honesty over persuasion. I told her abandonment is leaving someone helpless, not stepping away from manipulation. I told her love isn't proven by how much pain you tolerate. There was silence, long, unsteady silence, and then she whispered something unexpected. "I think I know that." That call changed something. Not because it fixed anything, but because it confirmed what I'd begun to accept. This story was larger than a single conflict. It was about patterns passed down quietly, defended loudly, and rarely questioned. After the call, memories surfaced that I'd once minimized. Moments when Grant twisted concern into obligation, when my boundaries were treated as betrayals, when my independence was framed as selfishness. I saw now how gradually it had happened, how easily love can be reshaped into leverage when fear is involved. Still, I didn't feel anger. What surprised me most was the absence of it. In its place was resolve, solid, unmovable. A few weeks later, I received an email from Grant himself. Short, controlled, almost legal in tone. He suggested mediation, claimed he wanted closure. The word caught my attention because closure is often a substitute for accountability, when someone wants the door reopened without acknowledging why it closed. I didn't reply immediately. I reread it days later, noticing what wasn't there. No acknowledgement of harm, no recognition of overreach, no acceptance of responsibility. Just the implication that time alone should absolve everything. That's when I knew my answer. I responded politely but firmly. I told him I was open to communication when it included accountability, not negotiation. When it focused on repair, not access. I told him I wished him stability, but I would not sacrifice my peace to create comfort for someone who refused reflection. After sending it, I didn't wait for a response. I went for a walk instead. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that feels introspective rather than bleak. As I walked, I realized something quietly profound. I was no longer afraid of being misunderstood. For years, I had bent myself into explanations, believing clarity would protect me. But clarity without boundaries only invites more distortion. Now, I understood that being misunderstood by someone committed to misunderstanding you is not failure, it's freedom. Grant did reply eventually. The message was longer this time, emotional in places, defensive in others. He accused me of rewriting history, of choosing pride over family, of punishing him for mistakes every parent makes. I read it once carefully and then archived it. Not out of spite, but out of discernment. I recognize the cycle too clearly now, the shift from victim to aggressor, from remorse to accusation. It wasn't new. It was familiar. And familiarity, I'd learned, doesn't mean safety. As winter approached, my life continued expanding in ways that felt almost unfamiliar. I volunteered at a community center, not to stay busy, but to stay connected. I hosted dinners without anxiety about who might dominate the conversation. I laughed more easily, slept more deeply. The absence of constant emotional vigilance gave me space to notice who showed up consistently, quietly, without demands. Those relationships strengthened naturally, without negotiation. Occasionally, I wondered what Grant told others now, whether he framed himself as misunderstood, betrayed, or burdened by an ungrateful parent. But those thoughts no longer lingered. They passed through like weather, acknowledged but not internalized. One evening, as I jungly ate old paperwork, I found a photo tucked inside a folder. Grant as a child, smiling without restraint, his hand gripping mine as if it were an anchor. I held it longer than I expected. Not with longing but with compassion for both of us. For the mother who loved fiercely but didn't know she was slowly being erased. For the child who grew up believing control was connection. I didn't put the photo back. I placed it somewhere visible, not as an invitation to reopen wounds, but as a reminder of truth in its full complexity. Love can exist without access. Memory can exist without obligation. And forgiveness, I realize, doesn't always mean reconciliation. It sometimes means release. As the year drew closer to its end, I felt a calm certainty settle in me. Not everything would be resolved neatly. Not every story would end with understanding on both sides. But my life no longer revolved around waiting for someone else to change. It revolved around honoring the clarity I'd earned. Whatever came next, another message, another attempt, or permanent silence, I was ready. Not armored with anger but grounded in truth. And for the first time, I trusted myself completely to protect the life I'd rebuilt. The year ended quietly without announcements or dramatic reconciliations, and that silence taught me more than noise ever had. On the last evening of December, I sat alone by the window, watching distant fireworks bloom and disappear in the sky, realizing that this was the first time in years I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. No phone in my hand, no expectation in my chest, just presence. I thought about how much energy I had spent trying to be understood by someone who only listened when it benefited him. I thought about the countless moments I'd questioned my own memory, my own intentions, because love had been tangled with guilt for so long that separation felt like cruelty. But sitting there, wrapped in a quiet that felt earned, I finally understood something simple and life-altering. Peace doesn't come from fixing relationships alone. It comes from fixing your relationship with yourself. In January, Grant sent one final message. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It simply said, "I don't agree with you, but I'll stop reaching out." There was no apology, no acknowledgement, but for the first time there was respect for distance. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted the last word, but because the story no longer required one. Closure had arrived without permission, shaped not by his understanding, but by my acceptance. As the months passed, people noticed a change in me. They said I looked lighter, more grounded. Some assumed time had healed everything. I didn't correct them. Time hadn't healed it, clarity had. The decision to stop explaining myself had been the turning point. I learned that boundaries don't harden your heart. They refine it. They teach you where compassion belongs and where it becomes self-erasure. There were still moments, holidays, certain songs, unexpected memories, when grief surfaced. But it was different now. It didn't demand action. It didn't drag me backward. It simply reminded me that loving deeply always leaves an imprint, even when love must change form. One afternoon in early spring, I ran into an old friend who had known Grant when he was younger. She hesitated before speaking, then said, "He talks about you like you're a chapter he doesn't understand." I smiled softly because that was the most honest description I'd heard. Not every chapter is meant to be reread. Some are meant to be learned from and then closed. My life, meanwhile, continued expanding, not dramatically but intentionally. I traveled alone for the first time in years, discovering that solitude can be expansive rather than lonely. I said no without guilt. I said yes without fear. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by how much of myself I gave away. On my birthday, I lit a candle and made a quiet wish. Not for reconciliation, not for vindication, but for continued courage. The courage to choose peace even when it's misunderstood. The courage to love without control. The courage to walk away without hatred. Looking back now, I see that this story was never about abandonment or loyalty, it was about identity. About what happens when a parent realizes that love does not require self-sacrifice to the point of invisibility. About what happens when a child grows up believing entitlement is connection. And about the painful, necessary moment when those beliefs collide. I don't know where Grant's journey will lead him. I hope he finds clarity, accountability, and peace in his own way. But I no longer carry responsibility for that outcome. My responsibility is here, in the life I wake up to, the values I protect, the boundaries I honor. If there's one truth this experience etched into me, it's this: choosing yourself is not betrayal. It's survival. And sometimes the bravest love story isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when letting go is the most honest form of care. As the sun sets now, I don't feel loss. I feel alignment. My life finally sounds like my own voice again. And that, more than anything, tells me I made the right choice.